A church stands amidst the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. Its majestic stone building radiated a quiet dignity under the winter sunlight. Early Sunday morning, 28-year-old Hannah Montgomery was diligently preparing the church's meal program with other volunteers. "It's cold again today," Hannah murmured as she looked out the window, her heart tightening as she thought of the people who spent their nights on the streets. Since her mother Rebecca's passing, she had become actively involved in the church's meal program. "Hannah, a new person has come," a volunteer called out. At the entrance stood a young man Hannah had never seen before, clad in a worn coat and looking tired, yet his demeanor retained a hint of refinement. "Good morning. Please come in," Hannah said with a warm smile, inviting the young man inside. "I'm Mike Foster," the young man whispered, his voice carrying an echo of his former education. "It's still warm. I just made it this morning." Hannah picked out a particularly well-stuffed sandwich and handed it to Mike. "Thank you," Mike said, accepting the sandwich carefully, his gestures reflecting the remnants of a once polite existence. "Feel free to come again. We hold this program every weekend." At Hannah's words, Mike nods, though slightly perplexed. The morning sun filtering through the church's stained glass cast a warm light between them. In this moment, no one could have anticipated the beginning of an unexpected story. However, the old church clock had started to mark a new time. This morning's events would eventually cause significant ripples. But for now, just one act of kindness quietly blended into the church's morning air. In the Montgomery mansion in Manhattan's upscale residential area, Marian Montgomery frowned deeply in her study. Reports on the church's trust fund were spread out on her desk, alongside piled-up letters of complaint from wealthy church members. Marian sighed and looked out the window, where the church's spire was visible in the distance. The events of the previous weekend haunted her. She had been irked by the sight of her stepdaughter Hannah engaging warmly with homeless people, particularly a young homeless man, during the church's meal program. A daughter of the Montgomery family shouldn't be associating with homeless people. Marian's remark reflected the strict values of New York's high society. The Montgomery family had been prominent in Wall Street's core for over 100 years, from the chaos following the Civil War through the Great Depression to the modern global finance era. The Park Avenue mansion symbolized their social status, unchanged in its dignity. 13 years ago, the mansion was struck by a great sorrow when Charles's first wife, Rebecca, died suddenly from an illness. At the time, 15-year-old Hannah could not accept her mother's death and took a long time to recover. Rebecca had been an unconventional figure. Although from the upper class, she passionately engaged in direct support activities and had even worked at a shelter for the homeless. Her actions sometimes drew frowns from high society, but her genuine compassion was loved by many. 2 years after Rebecca's death, Charles remarried Marian, who managed a chain of high-end jewelry stores and perfectly understood the behaviors expected in high society. For Marian, social contribution was something to be handled with caution, preferably in subtle ways like church donations or charity events. With the arrival of her new mother, Hannah harbored complex feelings. Marian, the perfect upper-class lady, demanded from Hannah the proper way of being, from choosing dresses to behavior and even dating. However, Hannah's heart was drawn to the spirit of direct support she had inherited from her mother. Caught between the elegant life of high society and supporting people living on the streets, Hannah was searching for her own path, firmly intending to carry on her biological mother Rebecca's will. Yet Marian viewed Hannah's changes with alarm. Valuing social appearances, Marian, as the administrator of the church's trust fund, could not afford to lose the trust of the members who made substantial donations every year. Mrs. Montgomery, the butler, entered the room. "Mrs. Williamson is on the phone about last weekend." Marian frowned. Mrs. Williamson was one of the church's major donors. "Put her through." Mrs. Williamson's sharp voice came through the phone. "Marian, your stepdaughter's behavior is degrading the church's dignity. There are too many homeless people lately. I apologize for the concern. I will handle it promptly." Marian replied politely while seething inside. The portrait of the late Rebecca on the study wall seemed to look down on Marian. Hannah's actions, inheriting Rebecca's charitable spirit, might indeed be commendable. However, they were incompatible with the church's practical operations. Marian resolved to change the situation. "We cannot leave this unchecked." Marian's voice echoed in the Montgomery family's reception room. Charles, her husband, listened silently to her words. "Charles, your daughter's actions are severely damaging the church's reputation. We had 3 complaints just last week." Marian sat elegantly on the sofa and spread out the letters on the table. "Hannah has a kind heart, like her mother." Charles quietly responded, seeing the image of his late wife Rebecca in his daughter, a secret comfort to him. For Charles, life with Marian, whom he had remarried on others' advice, felt somewhat hollow. Although it fulfilled the societal expectations and stabilized the Montgomery family's social position, the warm atmosphere he had with Rebecca had never returned in these 13 years. Marian played the perfect wife, hosting parties suitable for her husband's status, conducting appropriate charitable activities, and taking care of her daughter's education. However, all of it felt like a calculated act. Even at meals, their conversations were mere pleasantries, rarely exchanging heartfelt words. Marian had tried several times to remove Rebecca's portrait from the study's wall, but Charles had steadfastly refused to allow it. Since then, the rift between the couple had deepened. "How long do you intend to be imprisoned by Rebecca's shadow?" Marian asked the question, but Charles could not respond. He continued to cherish the warmth of the days he spent with Rebecca deep in his heart. At that moment, Claire Donovan, a long-standing member of the church and Rebecca's close friend who had become a surrogate mother to Hannah, visited. "Charles, Hannah's actions are truly in keeping with Rebecca's will." Claire began with a warm smile. "She understands true charity, just like her mother did." Marian clearly showed her displeasure at these words. There should be a proper form of charity. Direct involvement with the homeless is also dangerous. Rebecca was different. Claire countered quietly yet firmly. She believed that extending a hand directly to those in need was the truest form of faith. Charles sighed deeply between their exchanges. Rebecca's portrait on the wall seemed to quietly oversee the tension in the room. On another day, in the church's old accounting room, Arthur Winters was flipping through a dusty photo album. As the church's accountant for over 30 years, organizing records was part of his daily routine. "Oh, what's this?" Arthur's hand suddenly stopped. A photo tucked into a church annual report from 10 years ago showed Clyde Brooks, a former member of the church board. "It's almost like..." Arthur compared the young man he'd recently seen in the meal program, Mike Foster, with the young Clyde in the photo. The resemblance was too striking to be a coincidence. Clyde Brooks's accidental death was a dark memory for the church. He was said to have died in a late-night fire, his body completely burned, and his son had gone missing, leaving the case unsolved. "Mr. Winters." Marian Montgomery suddenly entered the accounting room. Are you looking at old photos? Yes, just from 10 years ago. As Arthur was about to show her the photo, Marian quickly grabbed it. Such a nostalgic photo, her voice sounded a bit higher than usual. But the past is the past. We must look forward. At that moment, a familiar brooch on Marian's chest shimmered. Arthur's memory stirred, trying to grasp something. That brooch, surely it had belonged to Clyde's wife. Noticing Arthur's gaze, Marian quickly left the accounting room. Left alone, Arthur turned his attention back to the old records, certain they contained the key to unlocking the truth of 10 years ago. In Marian's study, seated in an expensive leather chair, she was pondering a scheme. It had been only a few days since Mike appeared at the church, but Marian's keen observational skills had already identified a potential opportunity. Initially, she intended to dismiss the homeless young man Hannah had welcomed into the church as a mere nuisance. However, there was something different about this young man. His cautious demeanor, his cultured way of speaking, and above all, a familiar bearing. This might be useful. Marian muttered quietly, touching the brooch at her chest. Complaints from church trustees worried about the church's reputation, criticisms of Hannah's activities. Here was a possibility to resolve all these issues at once. If she could marry this homeless young man to Hannah, it would ostensibly be a new form of charitable activity that could preserve the church's reputation. Hannah's actions could be framed within the appropriate context of marriage. Moreover, the trustees who valued the church's image would have to accept this arrangement. Charitable work as a noble cause and maintaining influence over Hannah. Marian's mind was forming a plan. "Excuse me." Hannah entered Marian's room with a slightly tense expression, choosing her words carefully as she faced her stepmother. "Sorry for calling you suddenly. I wanted to talk about the activities you're so passionately involved in." At Marian's words, Hannah's expression hardened. "You seem very committed to your activities at the church," Marian noted, gracefully lifting her teacup, adding a strange tension to the conversation in the solemn atmosphere of the study. "Yes, I think support activities are important," Hannah replied, unsure of her stepmother's true intentions. "About a young man named Mike Foster." Marian intentionally paused. "He seems very sincere. He understands support activities well." "Yes, that's true." Hannah recalled the first day she met Mike, a few days ago at the church entrance in the morning mist. When she offered Mike a sandwich, she felt something different about him compared to other homeless people. The way he looked straight into Hannah's eyes and said, "Thank you," had a purity not dimmed by the harshness of street life. The way he handled the warm sandwich also retained a certain dignity, making Hannah strangely feel a sense of kinship. The next day, on a chilly morning with light rain, Mike visited the church again. While receiving his meal, he began, "Yesterday's sandwich was very tasty. Especially how the bread was cut smaller so I could eat all of it, including the crust." And then, slightly embarrassed, he trailed off. Hannah couldn't help but smile. Indeed, she had noticed that many homeless people left the hard crusts of bread, and had adjusted her cutting method the day before, thinking no one would notice. Mike had noticed her small act of consideration. And just yesterday, before dawn at the church, there was Mike again, arriving early to help prepare the meals. When Hannah tried to dissuade him, he quietly said, "If there's anything I can do to help," indicating a depth of feeling that went beyond mere gratitude. Afterwards, while making sandwiches together in the kitchen, their conversation naturally deepened. "These vegetables should be finely chopped, right?" Hannah said, and Mike quietly nodded. "Yes." Many people have bad teeth. Hannah was momentarily surprised by his remark, sensing a depth beyond mere experience as a homeless person. It's getting colder, isn't it? She continued. Mike stopped chopping and looked out the window. There are more people with chronic illnesses on the streets than you might think. Especially the elderly. He paused, then resumed chopping. But they have their pride, and often can't easily ask for help. Why do you know so much about this? Hannah asked, and after a pause, Mike answered. I once knew someone I couldn't help. Hannah was at a loss for words, overwhelmed by the weight of his statement. Instead, she quietly began washing lettuce leaves one by one. Why do you engage in activities like this? Mike then asked her. My mother, she believed that everyone deserves equal respect, regardless of their social status. Hannah responded, her voice warming as she spoke of her mother. She has passed away, but her sentiments live on in me. She must have been a wonderful person. Yes. Hannah's words trailed off as the morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a faint band of light between them. In that moment, it felt as though something greater than words was being communicated between them. I actually have a great proposal for you, Marian said, bringing Hannah back to reality. What is the proposal? Marian, with her back straight, reached into the drawer of her substantial ebony desk. Her perfectly manicured fingers slowly touched the brass handle. The sound of the drawer opening echoed oddly in the silence. With a refined smile, Marian pulled out a dark green leather case. Her movements had the elegance of someone showing off a precious jewel, yet a calculative glint hid behind her narrow eyes. She placed the case on the desk and lightly adjusted her white wrist scarf, then slowly opened the gold clasp of the leather case as if handling a crucial prop in a play. This is something I've prepared for you, she said, pulling out a thick document. Her expression carried the slight complacency of someone confident in their plan. Have you considered marrying him? Marry him? Hannah was stunned. She had enjoyed her time with Mike, but marriage had never crossed her mind. Yes. Think about it. Marian continued persuasively. You can continue your aid activities. We can preserve the church's reputation. And most importantly, you can offer real help to his friends. The documents Marian handed over detailed a comprehensive program for supporting the homeless, including medical aid, housing, and job training, the very support Hannah had desired, now laid out in a tangible plan. The medical aid section was particularly thorough, presenting viable solutions to the health issues faced by the homeless. With support of this scale, we can surely save many lives. Marian's words touched Hannah's heartstrings. Amidst her confusion and anticipation, her heart was torn. Was this a transaction or true charity? As she struggled to find an answer, a heavy silence fell in the dimming study. Consider it. You can reconcile your ideals with a practical solution. Hannah silently reviewed the documents again. Indeed, the scale of support outlined was beyond what she could achieve alone. Watching Hannah, Marian smiled quietly. Everything was proceeding as planned. In the church's small chapel, the evening light filtered through the stained glass, coloring the quiet space. Mike sat alone on an old wooden bench, pondering Marian's proposal. There's something we can do for your friends. Marian's words still echoed in his ears. Marriage can be just a formality. But in return, we can provide real support for them. Mike held the document detailing the support plans, including a medical program, housing support, and job training. Faces of his companions on the streets, especially the elderly with serious illnesses and disabled individuals, flashed through his mind. Is this really okay? He muttered to himself. Yet, the harsh realities he had seen on the streets bolstered his decision. Then Grace Shepherd, a church social worker, approached. You seem troubled. Ms. Shepherd. Would you like to talk about it? Grace, well versed in the realities of poverty and the limits of people's goodwill due to her years of community work, offered. Actually, Marion called me to the church's parlor yesterday. Mike began cautiously. At first, she listened intently to my concerns about supporting the homeless, especially the difficulties in accessing medical care for the elderly and disabled among them. He paused, then continued. And then, suddenly, she said, you could make this plan a reality. While handing me a thick plan for support, she proposed marrying Hannah. Mike smiled painfully as he sat deeper into the bench. It sounds unbelievable. But that plan. It details concrete solutions to the issues we face on the streets, 24-hour medical facilities, shelters, job training programs. It's a level of support I couldn't possibly achieve on my own right now. Mike looked outside, lowering his voice. Sure, the proposal is abnormal. Using marriage as a tool for a deal. But, for the friends freezing on the streets, those suffering from chronic illnesses without medical help, this plan could save them. I understand your feelings, but this is a transaction, not charity. Grace spoke kindly yet firmly, observing Mike's deep internal conflict. Yet, his resolve was firm. He stood from the church bench, facing the sunset through the stained glass. His expression, illuminated by the light, was a mix of anguish and determination. Will Tom's grandfather survive this winter? He whispered quietly, recalling the elderly man coughing the previous night. Jimmy might lose his sight completely in a few years. But the surgery costs. His throat tightened. Faces of his street companions appeared and disappeared in his mind. Mike picked up Marion's support plan again. Its weight felt like the weight of the lives of people he cared about. I know marriage shouldn't be for reasons like this, he said, standing straight. But I have people to protect. I can't overlook this opportunity, this chance to make the plan a reality. So I think I'll accept Mrs. Marion's proposal. At that moment, Mike's face bore the resolute expression of someone who has found something worth betting his life on to protect. The bell in the evening chapel rang, its tone wavering between blessing and warning. In the church hall, bathed in spring sunlight, Hannah and Mike were working on the new support program under the guidance of Grace Shepherd. Could we simplify these medical support application forms a bit more? Hannah frowned as she looked over the mountain of paperwork. The forms are too complicated for the elderly. Yes, many people struggle with the paperwork as far as I know. Mike replied, drawing on his own experiences. Their relationship had started formally, but through their daily activities, they had begun to recognize each other's goodness. Especially, their deep empathy for the vulnerable and passion for practical support were qualities they both shared. Mike, you really have a lot of experience with support activities. Hannah remarked with admiration. I've learned a lot on the streets. But also, before that. Mike's voice trailed off. There seemed to be something troubling about his past. You two are creating a wonderful synergy. At Grace's words, the two showed a bit of embarrassment. Grace watched them with a quiet smile. However, her years of experience as a social worker gave her an intuition that something about this situation was off. The sudden marriage proposal, Marion's grand support plan, and Mike's seemingly inevitable acceptance. To Grace, who had seen through the true nature of people through church support activities, this development did not seem like simple charity. Meanwhile, in the church's old archives room, Arthur Winters was meeting with the legal advisor, Simon Frost. Old newspaper articles and church records were spread out on the desk. "Mr. Frost, take a look at this photograph." Arthur presented a photo of Clyde Brooks, then placed next to it a recent photo of Mike, a young homeless man who had recently appeared at the church. "Here is the young man, Mike Foster, who appeared recently at the church." Simon compared the two photos and widened his eyes. This can't be a coincidence. The Brooks family's son was supposed to have disappeared after the accident. But the age and features match. Arthur opened an old church record. "Do we have detailed records of the accident?" That's the strange part. Key details are missing. Simon noted as they began to look more closely at the records. The time of the fire outbreak, the conditions at the scene, and various inconsistencies emerged. Marion took over as the trustee of the fund right after this accident. Simon observed. "Yes, and that brooch she wears. It was definitely Mrs. Brooks' keepsake." Arthur recalled. Mr. Brooks had treasured that brooch after his wife passed away. "I saw it on his desk the day before the fire. After the fire, the brooch disappeared. Then it appeared on Marion's chest. Is a DNA test possible? We need to proceed carefully. Especially if Mike really is Nathan Brooks, it would be reasonable to assume he may have amnesia. We need to help him regain his memory." Outside the window, dusk began to envelop the church. However, their quest had only just begun. Charles Montgomery was in his study alone, reading the diary of his late wife Rebecca, as the talk of his daughter's marriage arose, seeking answers in her words. To love someone means putting their happiness first. "Dad." Hannah knocked on the study door. "Come in, Hannah. Is this the right thing to do? Is this about Marion suggesting that young man Mike for marriage?" "Yes." Hannah sat across from her father. Uncertainty and determination intermingled in her eyes. "Mike is kind. But something. I feel like we're missing something important." Listening to his daughter, Charles felt his own heart wavering between societal expectations and her happiness. What would Rebecca have decided? "What does your heart tell you?" Charles borrowed his wife's often used phrase. Support activities are important. But there seems to be something deeper, something more truthful. From the study window, the church's spire was visible, perhaps hiding still unknown truths. "Mike, do you recognize anyone in this photo?" Arthur Winters gently presented a photo of Clyde Brooks in the church's small conference room, where they faced each other. Mike took the photo, stared at it for a while, and felt a sharp pain in his head. "This man is your father. Does the name Clyde Brooks ring a bell?" At Arthur's words, Mike's hands began to tremble. Just then, Marion entered the room, her brooch shining at her chest. "What are you doing here?" "This brooch." Mike's eyes fixed on the brooch as fragmented memories began to thaw like ice. "I remember this." With intense headaches, fragments of memory surfaced, of the night of the fire, the brooch, and more. Marion's expression momentarily stiffened. "I must be excused," she said, hurrying out of the room. "Do you recognize the brooch Marion was wearing?" "I'm not sure. But it feels familiar." Deep wrinkles furrowed Mike's brow as pain shot through his head again. 10 years ago, there was a tragic accident at this church. Arthur began slowly, his voice heavy. Clyde Brooks died in a late-night fire. He was a board member of the church and deeply committed to charity work, he continued, spreading out an old newspaper article. His son also disappeared the night of the fire. The police searched desperately, but my head. Mike clutched his temples as fragmented images flashed through his mind. Oh, flames, someone screams, and then. This brooch was a keepsake from Clyde Brooks' wife, your mother. Arthur quietly presented another photograph. It showed a woman with a gentle smile, wearing the brooch. Mom. Mike's voice trembled. After the fire, you were found in a state of amnesia. DNA results also support this. DNA testing? I apologize for conducting DNA testing without your permission. Arthur apologized deeply. When I first saw you, I felt a familiar presence. Arthur's gaze drifted into the distance. Your profile while talking to Hannah in the church's meal program, especially how you reach out to those in need, was exactly like Clyde's. But at that time, searching for the boy you once were, I couldn't be sure immediately. Still, as you started coming to church, that intuition grew stronger. Arthur pulled an old photograph from his pocket. This is a commemorative photo taken at the church 6 months before the fire. Clyde, you at that time, and Marion wearing that brooch. These coincidences were too much, he added quietly, pausing before continuing. Since you appeared at the church, I have reviewed the records of that night many times. The missing body, the unnatural location of the fire's outbreak, the missing brooch, all these mysteries began to connect because of your presence. And to be sure. Yes. Using old church items, including a choir robe you used to wear as a boy, which still had hairs attached to it, and your current DNA. Arthur, he interrupted Arthur's apologetic words gently. Thank you for continuing to search for the truth. But why did I? There might be a clue in this brooch to help recover your memory. Would you consider therapy to retrieve your past? Mike stared at the photograph for a long time and then nodded deeply. Please. I want to recover my true self. 6 months later. On the day of the wedding, bathed in the gentle autumn sunlight, the church was enveloped in a solemn atmosphere. As Mike underwent therapy to regain his memories, preparations for the ceremony quietly progressed. Hannah, in a pure white wedding dress, walked down the aisle with her father Charles. At the altar, Mike waited with a resolute expression. In his eyes, there was a depth characteristic of someone who had regained their past memories. Facing the gradually returning memories during weekly therapy sessions, the journey to this day was anything but smooth. But now, no one gathered in this chapel knows yet. No one knows that all the truths have returned to Mike, no, to Nathan's heart. Marion stood next to the priest conducting the ceremony, a satisfied smile on her face. She was still unaware that her plans were taking an unexpected turn. After the solemn ceremony, as the reception began next to the church, Marion stood up to speak, her champagne glass elegantly raised. Hannah, Mike, I heartily celebrate your union. I am very happy that we can share this splendid day with our family, she paused, surveying the room. And today marks a new step in our charity work. Excuse me, Nathan's calm voice interrupted Marion's speech. There's something I need to tell everyone. The room fell silent as Nathan stepped forward. My real name is Nathan Brooks. At those words, the venue buzzed. I lost my memory due to a fire 10 years ago. Recently, with someone's help, I remembered that I am Nathan Brooks. Marion's face drained of color. What are you starting to say? You are Nathan. Nathan turned to face her. Could you tell us the truth about that brooch? His calm yet firm voice filled the room. That brooch you always wear. It should be a keepsake from Mrs. Brooks, my mother. A murmur arose from the audience, and Charles's expression tensed up. Indeed, Marian always wore that brooch. She had claimed it was a nice find from an old jewelry shop, but Charles was beginning to recall that his old friend Clyde Brooks's wife had treasured a similar brooch. Marian, please explain the real origin of that brooch. Charles's voice carried a mix of responsibility towards his friend's family and suspicion towards his wife. This is. Marian's hands trembled slightly, losing her usual composure. 10 years ago, there was a tragic fire. Nathan continued calmly but firmly. And after the fire, mysteriously, only the brooch was missing. Arthur Winter's investigation made that clear. Charles's eyes moved back and forth between Marian and Nathan as years of suspicion seemed to be connecting all at once. Marian's voice quavered. At that moment, Simon Frost stood up. The DNA test results have confirmed that Mike Foster is indeed Nathan Brooks. The truth, breaking the long silence, had come to light. Grace Shepherd stood up, holding old church records in her hand. Marian, you altered the trust fund records 10 years ago, didn't you? What are you talking about? I did no such thing. I was working overtime in the church office on the night of the fire 10 years ago. Grace's voice rang out in the tense air. Late at night, I saw Mrs. Marian checking the trust fund records. At that time, I didn't realize it was tampering. Grace paused, her eyes downcast as if recalling painful memories. Afterwards, Arthur and I started to check the records. Documents were being rewritten, important evidence was being concealed. Arthur Winters stood up next to Grace to add, Grace and I have been trying to uncover the truth for years. However, without definitive evidence. Nathan's appearance and that brooch were the final pieces we had been waiting for. Grace's voice carried a hint of relief from years of helplessness. Arthur then presented old accounting records. Right after the fire, a large amount of funds was moved unnaturally. And Mrs. Brooks's keepsake brooch disappeared. It's not true. Marian's voice trembled, and the room continued to murmur. Marian collapsed into her chair as if defeated. On the night of the fire, Clyde had discovered definitive evidence of my embezzlement. I tried to stop him. But the fire, it went beyond my control. And Nathan? Arthur's calm voice resonated, causing Marian's face to distort. In the chaos of the fire, Nathan tried to save his father. She choked on her words. He fell down the stairs. I found him unconscious. In a panic. You left Nathan, who had lost his memory, just like that. Charles's voice shook. If I called an ambulance, everything would come to light. I put him in the car and drove him out of the city. When he regained consciousness, he remembered nothing. Marian's voice broke off. Unable to bear Charles's intense gaze, she continued. It was midnight. I drove to a location in the Bronx, a place no one knew. Her hands began to tremble. Nathan was confused. He couldn't remember his name or anything about his family. She sighed deeply and closed her eyes. I stopped the car in front of a small diner. I took some cash from my wallet and put it in his pocket. And then, Marian's voice was raspy. I called the diner to say there was a sick man outside, and then I drove away. I didn't look back. Didn't you ever look for him afterward? Hannah's voice was cold. At first, I couldn't bear the guilt and drove to that area several times. But I never found him. As years passed, I never imagined he would appear in this church. I didn't know Mike was Nathan until now. At that moment, Charles stood up. Is there anything else you're hiding? His voice was filled with confusion and anger toward the wife he had trusted. Marian, shaking, quietly shook her head. The crimes against Clyde and Nathan, that's everything. No more confessions followed. Already at the back of the hall, police called by Arthur Winters had arrived. Marian stood up without resistance, accompanied by the officers. As she turned back one last time, her eyes were a mix of relief and a decade's burden. Charles was crushed by the feeling of powerlessness for not being able to protect his friend Clyde. And he was speechless, facing the reality that Marian, the woman he had chosen, had taken the lives of his friend and his son. Clyde, forgive me. In a whispering voice, Charles closed his eyes as if praying, unable to forgive himself for not having seen the truth behind his best friend's death. The truth had been revealed in a more cruel manner than anyone could have anticipated. Dad. Hannah approached and took her father's hand. Let's look forward now. Nathan joined them, and the three stood in the churchyard. Then Charles, with trembling hands, touched Nathan's shoulder. Clyde, your father was my best friend. He was truly a great man. Yet, unspoken regrets filled Charles's eyes. Nathan gently shook his head and smiled. Charles, you have no need to apologize. My father always called you the conscience of this church. Is that so? Charles embraced Nathan. Decades of separation seemed to melt away in that moment. Nathan. From now on, I'll be like a father to you. Yes, tears of warmth glistened in Nathan's eyes. Let's start a real support activity, just like my father dreamed of. In the churchyard at dusk, a bond long lost was finally being reformed. A week later, a new wedding took place in the church. This time, it was based on genuine, pure love. At the end of the ceremony, Hannah and Nathan announced their new plan. We will establish a comprehensive homeless support center based here in this church. They plan to use Clyde's legacy to integrate medical support, job training, and housing assistance into a single program. Months later, the church's basement, after extensive renovations, was transformed into a modern support center. With Charles's full support, Hannah and Nathan turned their dream into reality. Today, the medical consultation room is officially open. Hannah announced to the gathered volunteers. From regular health checkups to referrals to specialists, we can provide comprehensive care. Nathan, along with his former peers, was preparing for the job training program. I'm grateful to be able to use my experience. Arthur Winters, as the center's financial advisor, was dedicated to creating a sustainable operation model. It is profoundly meaningful to see Clyde's legacy bear fruit like this, he commented. The support center began to attract many people daily. Homeless individuals found hope here and took new steps forward. It was exactly the scene Rebecca had dreamed of. Charles, watching his daughter and son-in-law's activities, opened his wife's diary. To do what we can for the ones we love. That is our mission, he read, finding new meaning in the words today. Meanwhile, Marian, in a women's prison, was confronting her sins with guidance from the chaplain. I was wrong about everything, she quietly told the chaplain. Chasing after honor and appearances, I lost sight of the true meaning of faith. During her incarceration, Marian began to understand the true intent of the Bible's words, especially about forgiveness and atonement. Before seeking forgiveness, I must first face myself. The chaplain's words deeply resonated with her. In prison, Marion started participating in support activities for other inmates. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of real change. Hannah and Nathan's activities are becoming well known across Manhattan. During a visit, Marion spoke to Charles with a calm expression. They truly are practitioners of genuine faith. Charles was quietly surprised by the change in his former wife, a sign of her sincere repentance. Under the winter sky in Manhattan, the church's support activities steadily spread to other churches. I am pleased that our experiences can be utilized in more places. Hannah told representatives from neighboring churches as she explained the details of their support program. Nathan, drawing on his own experiences, established a mental care program for the homeless, which received high praise from experts. Nathan's words carry the power of real-life experience. Grace Shepherd told the new social workers. That's a major strength of this program. The circle of support expanded throughout Manhattan, like a small light from one church illuminating the entire city. On Christmas Eve, the church was filled with warm light for a special service, busier than usual with support center users, volunteers, and the congregation gathered together. Today, we would like to offer a special prayer, the priest announced solemnly. For forgiveness, reconciliation, and a new beginning. Hannah and Nathan stood in front of the choir, joined by former homeless individuals ready to sing. Charles watched from the stage, seeing the church regain its true purpose through his children's efforts. The voices of amazing grace filled the church, carrying the hopes of those who had overcome adversity. Claire Donovan looked at the photos of the late Rebecca and Clyde. Their dreams have finally come to fruition. In the winter night sky, a large star shone brightly, symbolizing new hope. The church bells tolled across Manhattan, proclaiming peace. Merry Christmas, the words filled the church along with prayers for reconciliation and forgiveness. And thus, the story continues into a new chapter, an endless narrative woven by people's goodwill and faith. The church spire stands tall in the Manhattan sky, a beacon of hope for all.